It was a bright and sunny Saturday morning in a little place called Maple Grove. This neighborhood was super quiet, like the kind of place where nothing exciting ever happens. Birds were chirping happily in the trees, and the grass on everyone's lawns looked shiny and wet from the morning dew. It was the perfect day to be outside. And that's exactly where 12-year-old Max Harper was out on his back deck with his silly, drooly dog named Buster. Max was just a kid, and he didn't look like anything special. He was smaller than most boys his age, with messy brown hair that stuck up in all directions. He always had a big, goofy grin on his face, like he was up to something fun. But most people in Maple Grove didn't pay much attention to him. They'd see him playing with Buster, wave a quick hello, and keep walking. To them, Max was just a shy little boy with a dog that barked too loud sometimes. They thought he was totally normal, maybe even boring. But here's the thing, they were wrong. Really, really wrong. Max wasn't ordinary at all. Nope, not even a little bit. He had a secret, a huge, exciting secret that nobody in the neighborhood knew about. And that secret? It was about to shake up this sleepy street in a way no one could guess. But before I tell you what it is, let's talk about Max and Buster for a minute. They were the best of friends. Max loved Buster more than anything. Buster was a big, floppy dog with a wagging tail and a slobbery tongue that was always hanging out. He wasn't the smartest dog, but he was super friendly and made Max laugh all the time. That morning, Max was sitting on the deck, tossing a ball for Buster to chase. The sun was warm, and everything felt peaceful. Max wore his favorite red sneakers and a t-shirt with a dinosaur on it. He looked like any other kid having fun on a weekend. But inside, Max was different. He wasn't just playing around like everyone thought. He had something big going on, something that would make jaws drop if anyone found out. And soon, they would. Oh boy, would they ever. Now, let's picture Maple Grove for a second. It was one of those places where all the houses looked kind of the same: neat little yards, white fences, and flowers by the front doors. People mowed their lawns every Saturday, and kids rode bikes up and down the street. It was so calm that you'd think nothing crazy could ever happen. But crazy things don't care about quiet neighborhoods, do they? And Max's secret was about to prove that. Here's a fun question for you: what would you do if your dog started chewing on something he wasn't supposed to? Like, imagine your pup chomping on the couch or digging up the flowers. Would you yell? Laugh? Try to stop him? Max had that problem with Buster all the time. Buster loved chewing stuff, sticks, toys, even the deck sometimes. And that's where the story really starts to get wild. Because Buster chewing on the deck was about to set off something huge. See, Max and his family had only moved to Maple Grove a few months ago. They came in a big moving truck one day, and nobody thought much of it. New people show up in neighborhoods all the time, right? Max's mom was nice but quiet. She'd smile at the neighbors and say hi, but she didn't talk a lot. People figured she was just busy unpacking or something. Max's dad wasn't around much. Neighbors thought maybe he worked far away. And Max? Well, he just seemed like a regular kid with a loud dog. Nobody asked too many questions. But here's the first little hint: Max's family wasn't normal. Not even close. They weren't just here to live in a cute house and mow the lawn. They had a reason for being in Maple Grove, a secret reason. And Max was a big part of it. He didn't act like it, though. He'd run around with Buster, ride his bike, and wave at people like nothing was up. That's what made him so sneaky. Nobody saw what was coming: not the neighbors, not the mailman, not even nosy old Mrs. Jenkins, who watched everything from her porch. Let's talk about Buster for a second, because he's important too. Buster wasn't just any dog. He was a big, shaggy mutt with floppy ears and a tail that wagged like crazy. His fur was a mix of brown and black, and he always looked a little messy, like he just rolled in the grass. Max got him when he was a tiny puppy, and they'd been best buddies ever since. Buster barked at squirrels, chased his own tail, and drooled all over the place. To everyone else, he was just a silly pet. But to Max, Buster was more than that. He was part of the plan, the secret plan. Now, I know you're probably wondering, what's this big secret? What's Max hiding? Don't worry, I'm not going to spill it all yet. That would ruin the fun. This story is like a treasure hunt. You've got to stick around to find the gold. But I'll give you a tiny clue: Max wasn't scared of anything. Not loud noises, not mean kids, not even the dark. He had a brave heart, even if he looked small and quiet. And that bravery was about to come out in a way that would shock everyone. So, there they were that Saturday morning, Max and Buster on the deck, enjoying the sunshine. Max tossed the ball, and Buster ran after it, his big paws thumping on the wood. Everything seemed so normal, so boring. The neighbors were doing their usual stuff, mowing lawns, watering plants, sipping coffee on their porches. Nobody had any idea that this day was going to be different. Nobody knew that Max Harper, the little kid with the messy hair and the slobbery dog, was about to turn Maple Grove into the talk of the town. And it all started with Buster. That goofy dog was about to chew his way into something big, something that would make people gasp and whisper and maybe even cheer. But we're not there yet. Oh no, we're just getting started. This story's going to twist and turn like a roller coaster, and you won't believe where it ends up. So stick with me, okay? Because Max and Buster are about to take you on a ride you'll never forget. Before we go on, let me ask you one more time, what would you do if your dog started chewing on something he shouldn't? Would you stop him? Or would you let him keep going and see what happens? Max didn't stop Buster that day. And that's what made all the difference. Get ready, because this quiet little morning is about to explode into something wild. It was still that sunny Saturday morning in Maple Grove, and Max and Buster were just hanging out on the back deck. Everything was calm and happy. Buster was chewing on a stick, and Max was sitting there, watching the clouds float by. They weren't bothering anybody. They were just a kid and his dog, doing their own thing. But then, out of nowhere, she showed up. Her name was Karen Pritchard, and she was like the boss of Maple Grove, or at least, she thought she was. Karen was the kind of lady who acted like she owned the whole neighborhood. She was tall and skinny, with sharp eyes that could spot a weed from a mile away. If your grass grew too long, she'd grab a ruler, measure it, and then bang on your door to yell about it. If a leaf fell from your tree onto her perfect sidewalk, she'd march over and make a big fuss. Everyone in Maple Grove called her HOA Karen when she wasn't around. HOA stood for Homeowners Association, which was a group that made rules for the neighborhood. And Karen? She loved those rules more than anything. She thought it was her job to make sure everybody followed them, even if it made her super annoying. So, that morning, Karen came stomping across the street, her flip-flops slapping the pavement. She had her phone in her hand, and her face was all scrunched up like she'd just smelled something bad. She stopped right at Max's deck and stared at Buster. Buster didn't even notice her at first. He was too busy chewing on a loose board, his big teeth crunching the wood. Drool dripped from his mouth, and his tail wagged like crazy. To Max, it was funny. Buster was just being a silly dog. But to Karen? Oh no. To Karen, it was like Buster had set her house on fire. "Your mud's chewing on the deck," she yelled, pointing her bony finger at Buster. Her voice was loud and mean, like a teacher scolding a kid for talking in class. "That's property damage. I'm calling the cops." Max stopped moving. He just sat there, his eyes wide, like a deer caught in headlights. He was only 12 years old. What was he supposed to say to a grown-up like Karen? She was big and loud, and she looked ready to fight. Max didn't know what to do, so he stayed quiet. Karen didn't care that Max didn't answer. She didn't even give him a chance to talk. She just flipped open her phone and started dialing 911 right there, standing on the grass in front of the deck. She held the phone to her ear and started talking so loud the whole street could hear her. "Yes, hello, this is Karen Pritchard from Maple Grove," she said, her voice sharp and bossy. "There's a dangerous dog destroying my neighborhood. You need to send someone right now." Max's heart started beating super fast, like a drum in his chest. He could feel it thumping hard. A dangerous dog? Buster? That was crazy. Buster wouldn't hurt a fly, he'd probably just lick it to death. But Karen kept going. She paced back and forth, waving her free hand in the air like she was on a big stage. "This kid lets his dog ruin everything," she told the person on the phone. "It's chewing up the deck, and who knows what's next. This is a nice neighborhood, we can't have this." Max wanted to say something. He wanted to tell her to calm down, to stop being so dramatic. Buster wasn't dangerous, he was just hungry for a snack, and the deck was old anyway. But every time Max opened his mouth, Nothing came out. Karen was too loud, too fast. She wasn't the kind of person who listened to kids or anyone, really. While she talked, Karen shot Max a look. It wasn't a nice look. It was a smirk, a mean, twisty smile that said, "I've got you now." She thought she'd won already. She thought Max was just a scared little kid who couldn't do anything to stop her. In her mind, she was the queen of Maple Grove, and Max was just a nobody with a naughty dog. She stood there, all proud and smug, waiting for the police to show up and make everything go her way. She probably pictured them dragging Buster away and scolding Max in front of everybody. That's how Karen worked. She loved being in charge and making people feel small. But here's the thing, Max wasn't scared. Not deep down. Sure, his heart was racing, and his hands felt sweaty. Sure, he looked like a regular kid who didn't know what to do. But inside, Max was different. He wasn't shaking because he was afraid of Karen or the cops. He was shaking because something big was bubbling up inside him, something exciting, something powerful. Karen didn't know it, but Max wasn't just sitting there doing nothing. He was thinking. He was waiting. He had a secret, remember? And that secret was like a volcano, ready to blow up and surprise everybody. Max watched Karen with his big, quiet eyes. He saw how she puffed out her chest, acting like she owned the whole world. He heard her loud voice barking orders into the phone. He noticed how her flip-flops squeaked every time she took a step. Most kids would have run inside or begged her to stop. But Max didn't. He stayed right where he was, sitting on the deck next to Buster. And Buster? He just kept chewing, oblivious to the drama. Crunch, crunch, crunch went the wood in his mouth. Drool, drool, drool went the slobber on the deck. To Buster, it was just another fun day. To Karen, it was a crime. And to Max, it was the start of something huge. Karen finally hung up the phone and crossed her arms. "The police are coming," she said, her voice dripping with that mean smirk. "You're in big trouble now, kid." She looked so sure of herself, like she'd already won the fight. She didn't even think Max could fight back. To her, he was just a little boy with a messy dog and no power. But she didn't know the truth. She didn't know what Max was hiding. She didn't know that her big, loud plan was about to fall apart. Max's heart kept pounding, but his face stayed calm. He didn't smile back at her smirk. He didn't cry or yell. He just sat there, petting Buster's shaggy head. Inside, though, his mind was racing. He could feel it, the moment was coming. Something was brewing, like a storm getting ready to break. Karen thought she was the one in control, but she was wrong. Max wasn't scared, not even a little bit. He was ready. And whatever was about to happen, it was going to change everything in Maple Grove. So there they were, Karen standing tall with her phone, Buster chewing away like nothing was wrong, and Max sitting quietly, waiting for the right time. The air felt thick, like something big was about to pop. Karen thought she'd called the cops to win. But what she didn't know was that she'd just started a chain of events that would turn her world upside down. Stick around, because this is where the story gets really good. Those next few minutes on that sunny Saturday morning felt like they lasted forever. Max sat on the deck, petting Buster, while Karen stood there yelling and waving her arms. Then, everyone heard it, the sound of a police car coming down the street. It rolled up slow, its red and blue lights flashing bright in the sunlight. The car stopped right in front of Max's house, and two officers stepped out. They were big guys in dark uniforms, with shiny badges on their chests. One had a mustache, and the other carried a little notebook. They looked around, trying to figure out what was going on. Karen didn't waste a second. She ran over to them, flapping her arms like she was trying to fly. "Over here! Over here!" she shouted, pointing at Max and Buster. "This dog is a menace. He's destroying everything. And this kid, he's ruining our neighborhood." Her voice was loud and squeaky, like a mad cartoon character. She kept going, telling the officers how Buster was chewing the deck and how it was a big, terrible crime. She made it sound like Buster was some wild monster tearing the whole street apart. The officers walked closer to the deck. They looked at Max, who was still sitting there quietly. Then they looked at Buster. By now, Buster had stopped chewing the wood. He was wagging his big, fluffy tail so hard it thumped against the deck. Drool dripped from his mouth, making a little puddle. He didn't look like a menace at all, he looked like a happy, goofy dog who just wanted to play. The officer with the mustache scratched his head and frowned. "Ma'am," he said to Karen, "it's just a dog chewing some wood. It's not a big deal." But Karen wasn't having it. She stomped her foot and crossed her arms. "No. No. No," she yelled. "This is serious. That dog is dangerous. You need to arrest them right now." Her face turned red, and her eyes got all wild. She pointed at Max and Buster like they were the worst troublemakers ever. The officers looked at each other, confused. The one with the notebook shrugged. They didn't seem too worried about a slobbery dog and a quiet kid. But Karen kept pushing. She wanted them to do something big like put Max in handcuffs and take Buster away. Max didn't say a word. He just sat there, watching everything happen. He could have jumped up and told the officers that Karen was being silly. He could have said, "Hey, Buster's not hurting anyone." But he didn't. Not yet. Max was calm, even though his heart was still beating fast from before. He kept his hands on Buster's head, scratching behind his ears. Buster leaned into him, happy as could be. To everyone watching, Max looked like a regular kid who didn't know what to say. But inside, Max was different. He had a plan, a smart, sneaky plan, and he wasn't ready to show it yet. See, Max wasn't new to Karen's tricks. He and his family had moved to Maple Grove a few weeks ago, and ever since then, Max had been keeping his eyes on her. He'd seen her do all kinds of mean stuff. One time, he watched her yell at some little kids for riding their bikes too fast on the sidewalk. She stood there, shaking her fist, telling them they were breaking the rules. Another day, he saw her scream at old Mrs. Jenkins, who lived next door. Mrs. Jenkins had planted some bright yellow flowers in her yard, and Karen said they were ugly and against the neighborhood code. She even called the city once because a squirrel ran across her grass. Can you believe that? A squirrel. Max had noticed all of this. He wasn't just some kid with a dog who didn't care. He was smart, really smart. Every time Karen got mad or bossy, Max paid attention. He remembered the things she said and the way she acted. He saw how she treated people like they were doing everything wrong, even when they weren't. And the more he watched, the more he realized something. Karen thought she could boss everyone around forever. But Max knew better. He knew she wasn't as tough as she pretended to be. And he'd been waiting for just the right moment to do something about it. Back on the deck, the officers were still talking to Karen. "Ma'am, we can't arrest a dog for chewing a board," the mustache officer said. He sounded tired, like he didn't want to deal with her anymore. The other officer nodded. "Yeah, this isn't really a crime," he added, flipping his notebook shut. But Karen wouldn't stop. "You don't understand," she snapped. "This is my neighborhood. I keep it perfect. That dog and that kid are trouble." She kept pointing at Max, her finger shaking with anger. Max stayed quiet, but his brain was buzzing. He thought about all the times Karen had been mean. He remembered how she made Mrs. Jenkins cry about those flowers. He remembered how the bike kids rode away looking sad. He even remembered the squirrel, running off scared while Karen yelled into her phone. Max didn't like bullies. And Karen? She was the biggest bully in Maple Grove. But Max wasn't going to yell back at her or cry. Nope. He had something better up his sleeve, something she'd never see coming. The officers stepped closer to the deck. "Hey, kid," the mustache one said to Max. "Is this your dog?" Max nodded, still not saying much. "He chews stuff a lot?" the officer asked. Max shrugged and gave a little smile. "Yeah, sometimes," he said softly. His voice was small, but his eyes were bright. The officers chuckled. "He's a goofy one," the notebook officer said, watching Buster wag his tail. They didn't seem mad at all. They didn't think Max or Buster were trouble. But Karen did. And she wasn't giving up. "You're not listening," Karen shouted at the officers. "I called you to fix this. Do your job." She stomped her foot again, her flip-flops making a loud slap on the ground. The officers sighed. They looked like they wished they were anywhere else. Max watched them, then looked at Karen. She was so loud, so sure she was right. But Max knew something she didn't. He'd been waiting for a moment like this, a moment when Karen would push too far. And now, with the police here and everyone watching, that moment was getting closer. Max's secret, the big one he'd been hiding, was still tucked away. He wasn't ready to let it out yet. But little bits of it were starting to peek through. Like how he wasn't scared, even with Karen yelling and the police standing there. Like how he stayed calm when most kids would have run off. Max wasn't just some kid with a dog. He was clever. He was brave. And he'd been planning something special for weeks. Karen thought she was winning, but she was wrong. Every shout she made, every mean word she said, was bringing her closer to a big surprise, one she'd never forget. So there they stood, Karen arguing with the officers shaking their heads, and Max sitting quietly with Buster. The neighbors were starting to peek out their windows, wondering what all the noise was about. The air felt buzzy, like something exciting was about to happen. Karen thought she was in charge, but Max knew better. He was waiting for the perfect time to teach her a lesson that would change Maple Grove forever. And that time? It was almost here. Karen was in the middle of her loudest rant yet. She was waving her arms like a crazy windmill, yelling at the two police officers about how Max and Buster were the worst things to ever happen to Maple Grove. Her voice was so high and screechy it sounded like a whistle. "This dog is a disaster," she shouted. "And this kid doesn't belong here. Do something." The officers just stood there, looking tired and confused, not sure what to do with her. Max sat quietly on the deck, petting Buster, who was wagging his tail like nothing was wrong. The neighbors were peeking out their windows, watching the whole show. It was a big mess, and Karen thought she was winning. But then bam, something incredible happened. The back door of Max's house flew open with a loud creak. Everyone turned to look. Out stepped a group of grown UPS, and they weren't just any grown UPS. They were dressed in fancy black suits, the kind you see in movies. They had shiny badges clipped to their belts, sparkling in the sunlight. There were 5 of them, 3 men and 2 women, and they walked out onto the deck like they owned the place. The police officers stopped moving, like statues. Karen's mouth fell open so wide you could see her teeth. Even Buster stopped chewing his board and looked up, his big ears flopping. The air got super quiet, like the whole world was holding its breath. One of the suited people, a tall man with short hair, stepped forward. He had a serious face, but his voice was calm and strong. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking from Karen to the officers to Max. Nobody answered at first. Karen was too shocked to talk, and the officers just stared. Max, though. He finally opened his mouth. He'd been quiet this whole time, but now he was ready. He stood up from the deck, brushed off his jeans, and pointed at one of the women in the group. She had dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and a badge that looked extra important. "That's my mom," Max said, his voice clear and steady. "She's with the FBI. And these are her friends." The words hit like a thunderclap. The FBI? The real FBI? Everyone froze again. Karen's face turned bright red, redder than a ripe tomato. She tried to say something, but it came out all wobbly. "FBI," she stammered, her eyes bugging out. Max nodded, and a tiny, sneaky smirk crept onto his face. He wasn't just a quiet kid anymore, he was something way bigger. "Yep," he said. "And this isn't just our deck. This house. It's a sting operation. We've been watching the neighborhood for months. Guess who's been on our radar, Karen?" The air went so still you could hear a pin drop. Karen blinked fast, like she couldn't believe her ears. The officers looked at each other, their mouths open. The neighbors at their windows leaned closer, trying to hear every word. Max's mom stepped forward next to him. She was tall and strong, with a look that said she didn't mess around. "That's right," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "We're with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And we've been keeping an eye on things here." She glanced at Karen, and her eyes narrowed just a little. The other suited people, the FBI friends, moved closer too. They pulled out little notebooks from their pockets and started flipping through pages. One of them, a lady with glasses, whispered something to the police officers. The mustache officer nodded, like he was starting to understand. The notebook officer scribbled something down fast. Max's mom kept talking. "This house isn't just a home," she said. "It's part of our work. We moved here to watch someone who's been causing trouble. And that someone? It's you, Karen. Karen's legs wobbled like jelly. She looked like she might fall over. Me, she squeaked, her voice tiny now. Max's smirk got a little bigger. Yep, you, he said. You're not just a nosy neighbor, Karen. You've been up to some sneaky stuff. The FBI lady with glasses stepped up and held out her notebook. We've got proof, she said. You've been sneaking into people's yards when they're not home. You've been messing with their mail, taking letters and throwing them away. We've got pictures of you doing it. Karen's face went from red to white in a flash. She shook her head fast. No. That's not true, she yelled, but her voice was shaky now. Max's mom crossed her arms. Oh, it's true, she said. We've been tracking you for weeks. Every time you yelled at someone or broke a rule yourself, we wrote it down. And Max? He's been helping us the whole time. She put a hand on Max's shoulder and smiled at him. He's the perfect cover, just a kid with a dog, blending right in. The police officers turned to Karen, their faces serious now. The mustache one tilted his head. Wait a minute, he said. You mean she's the one in trouble? Not the kid. Max's mom nodded. That's right, she said. Max and Buster aren't the problem. Karen is. The notebook officer looked at Karen and frowned. Messing with mail? That's a big deal, he said. That's against the law. Karen started to back up, her flip-flops slipping on the grass. This is crazy, she shouted. I didn't do anything. But the FBI people weren't listening to her excuses. The tall man pulled out a little camera and showed the officers some pictures. Here she is, sneaking into Mrs. Jenkins' yard last week, he said. And here's her throwing out Mr. Carter's mail 2 days ago. The officers leaned in, looking at the proof. Their eyes got wide. Wow, the mustache one said. She's been busy. The neighbors at their windows started whispering to each other, pointing at Karen. They couldn't believe it either. Max stood there, watching it all. He'd known about this for weeks. His mom had told him the plan when they moved in, how they were here to catch someone breaking rules, someone who thought they were above everyone else. Max's job was to act normal, to play with Buster and ride his bike like any other kid. Nobody would suspect a 12-year-old with a goofy dog, right? It was the perfect trick. And now, with Karen caught red-handed, the secret was out. Max wasn't just a kid. He was part of something huge. Karen kept stammering, trying to talk her way out of it. I was just keeping the neighborhood nice, she said. But nobody believed her anymore. The FBI lady with glasses shook her head. You broke the law, Karen, she said. And we've got all the proof we need. Max's mom looked at the officers. She's your problem now, she said. We'll send you our files. The officers nodded, stepping toward Karen. She looked like a trapped animal, her eyes darting around. Max pet Buster again, who barked happily, oblivious to the drama. The big reveal was done. Karen wasn't the boss of Maple Grove, she was the bad guy. And Max? He was the hero who'd helped catch her, all while pretending to be a regular kid. The neighborhood would never be the same. Karen stood there, frozen, as the police officers turned to her. Her big, loud mouth was quiet for once. The officer with the mustache stepped closer, his face serious now. Ma'am, we're gonna need you to come with us, he said. His voice wasn't friendly anymore, it was firm, like he meant business. Karen's eyes got wide, and she started to sputter. What? No. You can't do this, she said, her words tripping over each other. But it didn't matter what she said. The officers weren't listening to her excuses anymore. The people in the fancy suits, the FBI agents, had all the proof they needed. They showed the officers pictures of Karen sneaking around in yards. They had videos of her throwing away people's mail. And best of all, they even had a recording of her voice, bragging about how she was teaching the neighborhood a lesson. Karen couldn't wiggle out of this one. The evidence was too strong. The mustache officer shook his head as he looked at it all. This is bad, he said. You're in big trouble. Karen kept arguing, but it was no use. The officers grabbed her arms gently and started walking her to the police car. She twisted her head back and glared at Max with mean, angry eyes. She looked like she wanted to yell at him one last time. But Max didn't care. He just smiled and gave her a little wave, like he was saying goodbye. Buster sat next to him, panting with his tongue out, happy as ever. The slobbery dog didn't even know what was going on, he was just glad to be with Max. As the officers put Karen in the back of the police car, the neighbors couldn't believe their eyes. They peeked out their windows, hiding behind curtains, whispering to each other. "Is that really Karen?" they said. "She's going away." For weeks, Karen had been the bossy lady who scared everyone. She'd yell about grass and flowers and squirrels, making people nervous. But now, her reign of terror was over. She wasn't the queen of Maple Grove anymore, she was just a lady in trouble. Max's mom watched the car drive off, then turned to Max. She reached down and ruffled his messy hair with her hand. "Good job keeping cool, kiddo," she said, smiling big. "You did awesome." Max grinned back at her. He'd stayed quiet and calm the whole time, even when Karen was yelling and the police showed up. That was part of the plan, to act like a regular kid until the right moment. And it worked perfectly. The other FBI agents looked at Max too. They nodded at him, like they were saying, "Wow, you're pretty great." One of them even gave him a thumbs up. Max wasn't just some kid anymore. He was the hero who'd helped stop the meanest lady on the block. Karen thought she could boss everyone forever, but Max and his mom proved her wrong. With Buster by his side, Max had helped bring justice to Maple Grove. The neighborhood was free and it felt good. And that's how it all happened in Maple Grove. A kid named Max and his silly dog Buster turned everything upside down. They stopped a big bully Karen who thought she was the boss of the whole world. She was loud and mean, but Max was smart and sneaky. He showed everyone that even a quiet kid can do amazing things. Sometimes, the people you don't notice, the ones who seem small or shy, are hiding the biggest surprises. So here's something to think about: next time you see someone quiet, don't think they're weak. They might be waiting for the perfect moment to shine, just like Max did. You never know what someone's got up their sleeve. Max didn't look like a hero, but he was. And maybe you could be too. What do you think, viewer? Could you pull off a big twist like Max? Could you surprise everyone with something awesome? I bet you could. Drop your answer in the comments below, I'd love to hear it. Stay brave, and maybe you'll be the next hero in your own story.